Conservation Commission, and we're really glad to have you all here. One of the things that we work hardest at is trying to educate people about Dormiston and the greater community, the whole, all of it. And so this is part of our effort to do that. And we co-sponsor this with the Bonnie Dale Environmental Education Center, and this is Patty Smith, and we happen to be related. So this is kind of a family effort here.
Yes.
And Eddie's also part of the
He's
program.
related too. And while I have you captive here, there's an event coming up on April 9th at the River Garden, and it's an opportunity for everyone to learn about various citizen science projects that need more volunteers. And so you're all invited. It's an open house, visit all the different tables, and it's 10 to noon. And if any of you are participating in projects now and would like to be represented at this event, it's Saturday morning. People of all ages. We're hoping to get some kids. We're hoping to get some retired people with lots of time and nothing to do, right? So,
What's the date?
April 9th.
April 9th.
And also, if anyone is interested in becoming a wildlife rehabilitator, you should also see me. I'm doing a Saturday workshop, 6 hours on March. Where are the glasses? Yeah. It's on this page here. I think it's the 12th. Thanks. Where's my pocket? Oh,
Underneath?
We feel your
anyway,
pain.
come and see me if you're interested. It's like the second Saturday in March. Good.
There's also wildlife rehabilitation at Marlboro College after the weekends. And there are workshops up there on Monday in the Total Health Center.
You also might want to check out, Patty has a neat blog. It's called The Fretful Porcupine.
The Fretful Porcupine.
Yeah.
If you would like to visit interesting porcupines in their dens in the winter,
Without going out of the snow.
without actually having to scramble up there. If someone's got to do it, you might as well enjoy what I see.
Do it in, so, and there's going to be, we're going to have a fish program with the state fish biologists. First week in April, I'm not sure when. And also, you're speaking on
March 4th, at the pleasure of March 4th,
Yeah,
at
March
7
4th.
o'clock.
Yes.
Where?
Here, on how to make your birds happy.
Okay.
There's a form the bird fills out to let you know.
Okay, anything else you want? Oh, and this is Bob Engel.
Yeah.
Why do you think we need it?
Dragged me out of my den, speaking of dens. I'm more than honored to be here. When Mary Ellen called me up and said, would you like to do something with communities? And she said, it's up to you what you do after. I said, well, what do you want me to do? She said, it's up to me. And so I'd like to delineate what I've decided to do. But I'm here at your pleasure. And I'm used to being $6, and that's reasonably affordable. Now I have to do 2.5 times better, and I'll try. But I really mean it. I am here at your pleasure. And if you wish to have a structure that's different than the one I've sort of dreamed up, or you'd like to emphasize some things more than other things, and I'll give you an idea where I'm headed, then please direct me to do so. I'm one of those retired persons. I'm sitting at home. There's nothing more I'd rather do than think about curricular structure. I mean it. And before I proceed, since he's decided to keep me honest and straight, sitting in the back row so he can do whatever he wants to do, is Arthur Westing, who has written this remarkable book that will tell you more than I can possibly tell you in 4 sessions we've got in front of us. I'm honored to know him, and I have used this book repeatedly when I was a functioning teacher. And to me, the most useful thing about it is his code of ethics, which is more than you wanted to know, category 1. He has appendices. And the first is his ethics, which I dragged over to the college and watched the young people yawn over. But for those of us who want to think about our impact on nature, his code of ethics is a great place to start. I don't think you'll be educated in this regard. As I look about, you all know what you're doing. But it's a good idea to be reminded. And my hat's off to my colleague in the back.
Do I have the right of rebuttal?
You do, as usual.
Thank you, Robert. Let me mention that anybody who would like a copy in PDF format, I could send it at any time. If you want a paper copy, I've run out, but I'm having a few more printed. And anybody who can wait a week or two and wants a paper copy, give me your name so I can get it to you. The PDF is free, the paper is $8. Oh, actually, if I hand it to you, it's less, but if I mail it to you, it's $8.
On the other hand, if you're desperate, my copy is available for $50 a day.
By the way, Bob, your little statement totally whelmed me. I mean, even overwhelmed me.
That's hard to do, sir. Here's what I propose to do. I propose to cram 2 full semester courses into 2 times 4 hours, 8 hours. The first would be a course on community ecology. Today's session would be something I'd loosely call the structure of communities. In other words, what are they? What's the history of the concept? How useful is it? What numerical values characterize communities? How do we evaluate membership in communities? And then we break for a week. And then we come back, and then I'd like to talk about, and it's perhaps more interesting, membership is probably determined mostly, but not exclusively, by interspecific interactions. For example, in a lot of community studies with birds, there are rules that we know about that describe membership in bird communities around the world. So they either co-occur, or there's a checkerboard pattern where 2 species don't ever co-occur, and they divide up the world, as you could imagine a checkerboard to look like. So from rules of membership among birds to the idea that plants are all the same, aren't they? Well, no. But we think they're much more similar than bird species are, and what, if anything, determines whether plants belong to an association of organisms or not. And are abiotic factors more important than biotic factors for animals? We'll try and explore that. That's next week. Then the next 2 sessions, good morning, I'd like to try and do something with what we call conservation biology, maybe a little bit of restoration biology in there. In other words, we spend 4 hours thinking about what we've got, what it means to us, and what we can do to save it. As you well know, our species is gnawing away at the planet at an ever-increasing rate, in spite of Arthur's code. And so we have to be far-thinking here. We have to think into the future, which is very hard for us to do. Humans respond in physiological time is a bit of dogma. We don't respond in ecological or evolutionary time. In other words, we don't think ahead. So we might try and do that as well. So those are the 2 sessions. So in the latter 2 sessions, we'll be talking about specific areas, how to make them better and more robust. The word is resilient these days. Everybody's talking about resilience. But we'll also become philosophers, because it's very hard to proceed at all unless you understand what your motivations are for coexisting and how committed you are to that concept with other species on the planet. I am philosophy light. I am not my colleague William, but I've become very interested in philosophy. It's way above my head, but nonetheless it's really quite interesting to think about what might be right and whether other organisms on the planet have rights at all, or whether it's our right to plunder the planet. So that's my scheme. And let me know at any event, any time, email, anything, if there's something you'd like me to cover, or thank you very much, I've had quite enough of that. All right. As another early piece here, this is the Natural Areas Journal, and it's a lovely little thing. Things come in here that don't have the gravitas to make it into scientific journals. And in here, I sort of went through this, seeing if there was something I could do from it for you. And here's a paper by two guys at Middlebury College, a biologist named Trombulak and a political scientist named Kleiza. And they're talking about a new natural history. So we're all natural historians here, whether we're alienating porcupines by sniffing around their dens in winter, or feeding beavers, or whatever we do. Picking on my buddy. We're natural historians. We study nature. It delights us. And we'd like to have that persist for those who might follow us, especially those of our own genes. So these people are arguing, and none of you is going to be shocked by this, for a different perspective toward natural history, which is not what your chickadees did today, but what your chickadees have done and will do in the context of you, environmental disturbances, and the dynamic aspects of the planet. So, the three main shifts in approach characterize the move from the traditional to the new natural history. One, the human role in altering the landscape is given a central place in the story. Every tree stump you see has been cut 4 times. The tree species composition is dramatically different than it used to be with the arrival of Europeans. More beech, more red spruce back then. Less beech, although it's making a valiant comeback. Much less red spruce. If you like what Bill McKibben has to say, and I very much do, when we affect the climate of the planet, there is no place on the planet where the impact of humanity has not yet reached. So these people are making it clear to us that we have a profound impact that can be detrimental but can also be positive. And we need to insinuate ourselves into the planet. Philosophically, you've already done so perhaps. Perhaps you think, I am a member of a larger community. I am an animal like those animals. I do draw resources from this planet, and I compete with others of my kind and other species for those resources. How can I marginalize my impact? You know this. The specific place is embedded in a larger regional context, Dummerston. Dummerston, Vermont by itself, I hate to say it, is not much of a nature reserve. It will depend dramatically on links to adjoining towns, links to the National Forest, and links to the great northern forest that stretches from the Adirondacks all the way to Maine, at least for now, and into Quebec. So we can't understand what's going on here, what will go on here, unless we consider that sort of landscape before us. Dummerston is wonderful. You're the most aggressive conservation commission I've heard of, and I admire everything you do. But I'm sorry to say we have to think larger than that if we're going to do much. C, or 3, a dynamic perspective of natural landscapes is embraced. Dynamic perspective. Dynamism has a lot of meanings, but in this case, it's change. Things happen. About every 75 years, for example, a hurricane or a tropical storm comes through here and does a great deal of damage. But we also need to think that we can't understand the communities that are here before us unless we consider that we're in an interglacial now. Oh, don't do that to me. That's okay. So the glacial epoch that ended 8,000 years ago and allowed species that were refuging along the Mississippi and Memphis, Tennessee, and so on, to come back north. 8,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. They've only been here a little while. And we're going to try and make sense of their existence here. In the absence of that information, it's not really a viable way to look at things. So that's what they mean by dynamic. And there are biological dynamic processes. Somebody was talking about coyotes this morning. Coyotes didn't used to be here. Neither did turkey vultures. But they're both here largely as a result of our impact on the systems. And so may be Zika virus some summer. So we have enormous impacts on the other biota, and they in turn on us. So we need to keep that. That's part of the new natural history too. A dynamic ecosystem that changes and changes and changes. Very little is static. It's a new way to look at the world as far as I can tell. People talked about climax crops and succession and endpoints and so on and so forth. We don't talk about that anymore. We talk about change, disturbance, resilience, and the like. Okay, so at least it knows who I am. I want to start with a definition, and the cynics among us are going to say that there's so many uses of the term community that it's almost a useless term. So for example, bird communities, dragonfly communities, butterfly communities, tree communities. We use the community as a taxonomic vessel. We're taking a taxon and we're calling it a community. And that allows us to conceptualize things a little bit more easily. One of my favorite communities, not my favorite, is cow pie, especially when the cow pies are occupied by dung flies. My cherished wife got some manure once, and it was not composted, and the truck backed up, and I looked out the window from upstairs, and the contents of the truck were sloshing back and forth. Truck dumped it, truck left, and talk about being blessed. There were dung flies. They look like golden raisins, and the males are fighting aggressively for access to females who are looking for the right patch of dung to lay her eggs, so the larvae have something nice and nutritious to eat. And I'm sorry, if your dung is too dry or composted, it will not work. So one can think about that and to make bog communities a kind of wetland to be found in this remarkable book, Liz Thompson's incredible book on plant communities. Pitcher plant communities. Pitcher plants of Borneo. Pitcher plants have evolved multiple times, and they have pitchers that contain digestive enzymes and augment their nitrogen budgets. We have pitchers where the leaf has furled up into a pitcher. The pitchers in Borneo a tendril has grown out and has become a pitcher. So the end of the leaf, and then this wonderful pitcher at the end of it. Full of water, digestive enzymes, lots of insects, lots of decomposers, lots of bacteria, and so on. This is a diagram of one of those pitchers that's occupied by a crab spider up there. Crab spiders occur in Vermont. If you like to look at goldenrods, you'll find a yellowish spider with its legs out like a crab. It's a sit-and-wait predator, and it's waiting for a pollinator. Naughty crab spider. But in this case, the crab spiders are inside the pitchers waiting for unlucky insects to come in there. Why would an insect come in there? Because this plant produces some nectar to attract them. And come they do, and the spider gets some, and the plant gets some. So this is an honest-to-God living, breathing community, according to this book. I'll skip that. Just invite you to think about Dummerston, living in Dummerston, or wherever it is that you live. You interact with your conspecifics. You interact with your environment. You plant your garden. You take maple syrup away from a tree. You do a bunch of things. The strengths of the interactions between you varies from people you like to people you hardly see. Your impact on those people is more or less as a result of the interaction strength that you exhibit. You're affected, and so are your interactions, by the climate. When it snows, all of a sudden everybody's friendlier and somebody's shoveling Mrs. Wilson's street, her sidewalk rather. Things happen. Interactions change as a function of abiotic factors in Dummerston, or Marlborough, or Newfane, even Brattleboro, as a function of abiotic variables and your interaction strengths with those around you, including pets, domestic animals, and wild animals. Do you feed wildlife or not? So Dummerston's a community in the general use of the term. So the definition we're going to use here is that a community is a group of interacting species that co-occur in space and time. It's a fancy way of saying they live together about the same time, therefore they interact with each other. So interacting species that co-occur in space and time. People talk a lot about space, but time also has to be. If you're not there when the devil's there, you're not going to meet him. So interactions in space and time. One of my favorite times of year is when neotropical migratory birds return to Vermont. End of April, I have a little notebook at home. First time I hear one or see one, write it down. For 15 years now in the new location. Well, they're community members, but they're seasonal community members. We won't deny that they play an important role in the ecosystem or the community, but they come and they go. So that's a kind of interaction that's a little different than the interactions that occur among permanent residents. I have a friend who taught briefly at Marlborough College. She's in Alaska now, and she's a paleobotanist. And she said, I never get over the idea that you ecologists never think about paleobiology, paleobotany. These trees have only been here for how many generations? Divide 8,000 by 50, say. Do you think these are co-evolved units that interact with each other in a relatively organized and static capacity? Think again, bozo. These are organisms that barely know each other in the evolutionary sense. They know each other in the ecological sense, but they have not had the time to co-evolve into a well-knit group of organisms. That, in other words, we could lose species still. And if we stay out of the picture, maybe beach kicks out a bunch of things. So she makes the point that community interactions have to be, again, considered in the context of time. So these communities that we are looking at are relatively new because of the last glacial epoch. So interactions, newish, some of them. Amphibians. Arthur did an incredible piece on buffer zones around so-called vernal pools. Everybody's got vernal pools. In California, they last about that long. But here, we even have one on Hogback Mountain that we call a vernal pool that is permanently full of water. It just doesn't have fish. So it houses amphibia and so on and so forth. But those amphibians leave the water and become terrestrial organisms. So they left their community and they join another community. Or if you're a redback salamander, I don't need no water. I can breed right here on the land. Thank you very much. So amphibians move seamlessly among communities. And because they're so abundant, salamanders in particular, they consume an enormous amount of biomass in the terrestrial system. even though they were born and raised in an aquatic system. So again, the interactions are these pores, these loose areas. Oregon wine. My lifelong friend John Hayes lives close to the Willamette Valley in Oregon, and he loves to go to these wineries where you take your picnic, and there's a bald eagle on the lake. You take your picnic and you buy a bottle of wine and you sit out there thinking about the larger issues, or not in his case. So the wine that you're drinking could have salmon nutrients in it. 18 miles from a river that still has salmon, there aren't a lot of them, people have recorded salmon nutrients in the grapes, in the wine, 18, 20 miles away from the source of the water. If you want to know how we know that, I'd be happy to tell you at a break or something like that, but we know that. So those salmon nutrients left the ocean, left the stream, the natal stream, and made their way into the wine you're drinking. Not in very notes of oak and tannin and salmon, not that much, but something. Amazing. So these things are semi-permeable, these communities, and they're seasonal. So what I'm trying to do is chip away at your idea that these things are rigid, well-defined, and I'm sorry, Liz, because she makes them sound that way. And she's a plant ecologist, and plant ecologists are responsible for the whole idea in the first place. So I'm in no way critical. She's forgotten more than I know about the flora of this state. But, sir.
So you talked about the vegetative species moving up here, like from Memphis. So I was getting this picture of, they were all down there on vacation, and then 100,000 years passed, and they all came up here. But you're also saying they don't relate, or they're relating to each other now, but they haven't co-evolved together.
Right. I don't know what will happen to them because we're in the picture, because the climate is changing. So I have no idea. There'll be forest here, but it's going to be a different forest, assuming we want a forest. The point is, if species interaction determine in some way, large or small, membership in communities, presence in the eastern woodland community where so-and-so and so-and-so and so on are usually found. If interactions among those plants are important in determining in any way membership, they don't know each other yet in that way. They're interacting, populations will fluctuate, we're playing a role, we cut things down, they return. The question is, how much evolutionary history have they had together? We have a snapshot in front of us, the picture of here and now. The question is, if these things are dynamic, if membership, participation in an association is dynamic, then neither the birds nor the plants have settled into some sort of end state. They may not ever do that because, as I say, it's a dynamic world and we're supposed to keep that in mind when we talk about the new natural history. I know it sounds vague, but to somebody, an animal ecologist who thinks, boy, you've got predators here, that means no so-and-so, you've got a strict competitor for something here, that means it's not going to be here, blah, blah, blah. It's a little hard for me to shift to plants because they're subtler, and I'm going to make that point in a minute. They're dramatically subtler, but they do interact. As Arthur points out, they interact especially through fungal connections among them. So the question is, do they like each other? Are they comfortable with each other? Is one eventually going to outcompete the other for those fungal connections, for changing soils, for soils which become increasingly less glacial and richer and deeper? Under those circumstances, who wins the game? That's what I'm getting at. Well, in a sense, a community is a taxonomic term. That's going to come out here. You have cells in your body. A cell is a an entity that all of us recognize. And it can be a self-contained entity. We have protozoa. So we understand a cell as a level of organization that depends upon the contents of the cell, the reactions within the cell. So is an organism. An organism, if I don't have a heart, I'm not doing very well here. If I don't have my kidneys, I'm not doing very well. So I need my bits. The question is, does a community need its bits, its members, to function as an ecological unit? Is it another level of organization on par with a cell or an organism? Well, that's a good question. What the heck is an ecosystem then? Well, an ecosystem is usually something bigger, but then you start building in much more of the abiotic factors of physical geography and climate. But the terms, it's easy to slip back and forth between the use of the term ecosystem and community. And nobody is going to get ruffled if you do so. The ecosystem in southern Vermont consists of a number of communities. Nobody's going to bat an eye at that, but as long as you know that these are malleable concepts, you'll be better off for it. Okay, so plant ecologists. Anybody who's studied ecology has run into the term, to Frederick Clements and Henry Gleason. And we're still not comfortable with the debate that their ideas started. It's still in the literature. The continuum that exists within a community, where does it begin, where does it end? That's what we're worried about still. So Frederick Clements was a plant ecologist, and he decided that communities often had strict boundaries, and they frequently don't, but they sometimes do. And they tend to have consistent representation by species, which he likened to organs. So all of the maple trees in a patch of whatever Liz is going to call it are organs, a kind of organ for Clement. Further, these things regenerate, i.e. they undergo succession. If you cut them down or a hurricane blows them down, then they slowly return in a series of stages, which ecologists call seral stages in the process of succession. We'll talk about it more. That are repeatable and a bit like an embryo, looking less like a fish and more like an amphibian, and eventually it looks like Junior. Those seral stages, it just was overwhelming to him, the similarities in a return to an adult organismal condition. They develop that way, they're consistent, and they seem to be relatively defined. It was powerful stuff. A superorganism was his notion of a community.
Right.
Please, yes you may.
When you say going through the stages, do you mean, for instance, the stages the maple tree itself goes through to get to back to its maturity, or do you mean the
goldenrods.
stages that the land goes through to get back to a maple forest?
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean goldenrod, I mean the occasional pine tree,
Right.
I mean white birch, and then I mean eventually yellow birch, hemlock, maple, beech. So those were developmental stages for him. And it's a reasonable metaphor. So, the next person, Henry Gleason, said, you know what? It's baloney. Communities are assemblages of organisms, fortuitous assemblages of organisms, which have common requirements. Period. That's it. Get over this idea of superorganism. And Clements responded once and Gleason responded again. So this leads us to what I consider to be modern times anyway, at least it's my lifetime. Robert Whitaker used a process, a kind of ordination. Aren't you supposed to be in New York City?
Not yet.
Okay. Whitaker did something, he found an environmental gradient, and he worked in the Smokies and he worked in the Santa Catalina Mountains near Tucson, Arizona. And he went up the mountains and he found species appearing and disappearing as he went up the mountains, i.e. he followed a moisture gradient from less moisture to more moisture. And he said, look, those trees up higher are not down here because it's not moist enough for them. It's cooler and it's moister up there. And the stuff down here can't make it up there because it's too cool and too wet. So he said, a community is a fortuitous assemblage of organisms. So, sorry, Casey. Here's what they say. And I don't want to spend a lot of time reading Clemens's prose. The plant formation is an organic unit. According to this point of view, the formation is a complex organism which possesses functions and structures and passes through a cycle of development similar to that of a plant. Since the formation, like the plant, is subject to changes caused by the habitat, and since these changes are recorded in its structure, it is evident that the terms function and structure are as applicable to one as the other. In other words, the community is an organism that has structure and function.
So that was Gleason? Or
That's
was that
Clemens.
Clemens, okay.
So here's Gleason's take. There is nothing comparable to reproduction in any assemblage of plants. In other words, if it's an organism, it reproduces. And there's nothing like that. Its liver, kidneys, and so on reproduce, but not the organism, the superorganism. Far from being an organism, an association, a community, is merely the fortuitous juxtaposition of plants. What plants? Those that can live together under the physical environment and under their interlocking spheres of influence, and which are already located within migrating distance. This last point is the first time it appears, and it should be at the forefront of your minds about this. You can't get there from here. If you can't, you're not a member of the community. So immigration and migration, how far you have to come and via what routes, also play a role in whether the thing is in a community or an association. Now, so that's Whitaker. He uses something called gradient analysis.
I have one question.
Please.
So are you saying that if something isn't present at the time, like our migrating birds, that they are not members of the community in that given period of time?
Well, that's the tricky question, TD. It is nice to see you.
You too.
That's the tricky question about what membership is. If it's episodic or periodic or seasonal, is it a community member or not? So are tropical birds community members in Vermont? Yeah, they are. They consume biomass, they're consumed themselves, they prevent trees from getting denuded by insects. They're important players, but they're only seasonal players instead of permanent players. On the other hand, coming from California, I can't believe that anything plays any role whatsoever in the typical winter in Vermont. I could find a flower in bloom in the chaparral any day of the year. And then here I am. So, meta-community. This term is in the literature now, and it's people looking for a new take. Their gripe is that community ecology has dealt with relatively anecdotal aspects of what one species does to another species. These two species are competing for whatever it is. And I'm going to show you this by whatever I do, QED. Well, that's anecdotology, they're arguing. Geology used to be an anecdotal science and got no respect whatsoever until it came up with what? Plate tectonics. So with plate tectonics, all of a sudden geologists can explain why the world looks like it does. And all of a sudden, hey, we're a science too. So the question is community ecology, does it have any real organizing ideas, any real theoretical power? Or is it a series of anecdotes about ants and rodents in Arizona on a plot near the Chiricahua Mountains, both doing similar things? Ooh, gee whiz, that's important. Well, it's nice to know, but what do you really know about communities as a result of those kinds of studies? That's their concern. So maybe we can squeeze something out of this if we consider the meta-community, something bigger, and we beat the hell out of it statistically, say. There's a whole lot of macroecology, meta-community analyses going on right now. It's not to the level of Gaia yet, but can we see different patterns and generate different hypotheses by increasing the scale of analysis, is the question. And we're advised to do that by Trombilac, are we not, in the new natural history? Maybe not to that scale, but we have to think bigger than Dummerston. Okay, now, here's something I just toss in because it's fun. I think it is for me. I just toss in so that we can ask the question. As you know, in the 90s, Molly Beatty, before she died of cancer, got to truck out a wolf into one of the holding pens in the Lamar Valley. And it just breaks my heart that she's not there to know what she started. She was the director of Fish and Game and lived in Newfoundland. So we've introduced wolves, and all hell broke loose in Yellowstone National Park. And where I'm going with this is, okay, if wolves aren't the heart of this ecosystem, what are they? In other words, with a profound, measurable impact on a community, should we think, that organismal metaphor may not be such a bad idea in some respects anyway? So I invite you to consider this. We throw wolves into the system, their numbers got large, they've come back down. And the thing they've done that's gets the most attention there is that most of the big ungulates come down to the northern part of the park because it's the lowest elevation. It's a grassland. So I'm an ungulate, I'm interested in grass. So I go there. Well, predators go there as well. That's where lunch is. So wolves have been tossed back into this mix, and they now mean that Yellowstone National Park is a complete ecosystem, or if you like, community. It has everybody who historically had been there, with the possibility of lynx not being there. Everyone who had been there is there. So what happened? Well, as I said, all hell broke loose. So the first important interaction, and it's one that's gotten all the attention, is the effect of wolves on elk. There have been two effects. First of all, they've driven the numbers down by literally and actually consuming the elk, but they've also changed elk behavior. I'll tell you what, if I'm a prey species and I know what my predator is going to do, I'm not going to be there. I'm going to minimize my contact by changing my behavior. So predators have both effects. They actually cull the population, but they change the population's behavior. What that means is elk don't march around like it's some sort of Mardi Gras parade anymore. They're careful about what they do, which means that woody vegetation along streams has returned. These are mostly willows, but they're seedlings from trees and the like. What that means, forgive me, is that riparian animals, and it was especially birds, return to the stream side because they've got places to nest, they've got some cover, they've got perches, they can sing their brains out. So wolves affected birds and other riparian animals by eliminating an herbivore that allowed the vegetation to regrow, that allowed the reoccupation of the area. In other words, wolves have a positive effect on birds. It's an indirect effect, therefore it's dotted. Patty.
You're forgetting the most important riparian animal.
I'm sorry. Beavers are also doing much better. On the other hand, wolves, forgive me, I cannot get rid of this. Wolves are notorious predators of beaver, too. It's just a matter of whether they can get there. It's the second commonest thing they eat on Isle Royale. But
Beavers can live there again.
yes, indeed they can. So, direct effects, indirect effects. Who would have guessed that wolves are good for McGillivray's warbler? Who would have guessed? So look at the rest of this. They have a negative impact, and vice versa, on mountain lions because they directly compete for the same kind of prey. They have a positive effect on grizzly bears who have a negative effect on them. How can that be? Well, I'm a grizzly bear, and you know what? I hate this running around after food. Why don't I let the wolves take care of it for me? And I'll just follow them around in a couple of miles. Oh yeah, there it is. And I go over there and say, sorry, mine. In other words, they're now grizzly bears specializing on chasing wolf packs away from their kills. So, who would have guessed? Wolves have a positive effect on ravens and magpies, which attend every wolf kill there has been recorded thus far. Ravens are smart people. Could they get to the point where they say, yo, wolves, there's an injured bison over here with a broken leg. Follow me. Caw, caw, caw. There is a bird that specializes in doing that in Africa. It calls honey badgers over to tear open beehives, and it will direct people to beehives who people want honey. So, can ravens do that? I wouldn't put it past them. Grizzly bears have a positive effect on ravens, blah, 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 blah. Wolves have an indirect positive effect on things like shrews because they allow carcasses to sit there, and scavenging insects, which are attractive to insectivores, are much more abundant. So the insectivores are more abundant. Wolves have a positive effect indirect effect on insectivores, and on it goes. Maybe on red foxes, because wolves don't like coyotes. They killed them for a while, but coyotes said, you know what, I'm smarter than you think I am, I'm going to avoid you as well. So that dynamic has been reduced, but coyotes have a negative effect on foxes, we think. It isn't written in stone yet. So wolves have an indirect positive effect on red foxes. And on it goes. So this is one species. This is 100 animals spread over 2,500 square miles. And look at what it's done. Appropriately enough, and I'll get there, again, we call these things keystone species because in their absence, the system is utterly different. So if this kind of important impact occurs as a result of a single species being in the system, then why isn't this the equivalent of a major organ in that community? Okay. I'll take 5 minutes. Communities have species in them. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit now. That's not a revelation either. None of this should be a revelation. And my organization may or may not seem right to you. I understand. But organisms have species, and you all know the notion of species diversity. But ecologists worry about that. In 1961, Robert and John MacArthur asked the question rhetorically, which is the more diverse of these two communities? Both have two species, but in the first, there are 99 individuals of one and one of the other species, whereas in the second community, there are 50 of each. Which one is more diverse? B. Okay, so they made their point. So we've come up with two ways to look at species diversity. Richness, which is the term we use for you count them up and that's what you've got. And evenness is the relative equability of the species there. If they're all relatively equal in numbers, you have high species evenness, regardless of the number of individuals that are there. So species evenness and species richness are the terms that one wants to use to be precise, because species diversity can refer to either and is guaranteed to confuse everybody, them and us, the scientists and us. So there's alpha, beta, and gamma too. You go out to your favorite piece of woodland, it's a remnant, and it has 2 vernal pools in it. And you somehow manage to count up all the species present, and it has higher species richness than the same sized patch of woodland without 2 vernal pools. How does one deal with that? One talks about alpha diversity as occurring in a relatively homogeneous patch of something, and beta diversity as indicating turnover, i.e., once you get to a different kind of patch within your patch, you start to encounter something called beta diversity. It's habitat specificity, mostly. It's used occasionally with time now. So seasonally, beta diversity in some woodland is going to be different in the winter than in the summer. Don't let these things rile your notion. We're still counting species. Gamma diversity is large-scale stuff, and it's meant to look for endemism. If you have high gamma diversity in Colombia, South America, it's because there are lots, in the birds, there are lots and lots of pockets of rare birds scattered around, i.e., endemism is high. The term endemism is almost useless as well, as far as I'm concerned, because I've heard the statement that Douglas fir is endemic to the western United States. Gee, that's really useful information. It's out there somewhere. So endemism, if you think it's meant to define small pockets of unusual things, stick with that notion. It's used even to include things whose ranges are half of the country. So stick with the former, small pockets. Gamma diversity picks that up. There are 2 ways, once you've found this out, you've gone out there and you and others like you have spent ungodly numbers of hours tallying up, doing a bio-blitz, whatever we call it these days. There are 2 ways to show these patterns. This is a rank abundance graph, and it shows 2 whatevers, vernal pools, 2 streams, 2 woodlots, and whatever you're counting in there. In this one, there are only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 species. And there are 2 or 3 of them that are pretty common. This is essentially abundance on this graph. And then there are 3 of them which are less common. There is high unevenness in this community. Whereas here, the evenness is much more evident. In other words, there are a few things which are more abundant, and you tell me where to draw the line, and there are a few things which are mid-level abundant, and then there are 2 things which are a little bit less. But by and large, the slope of this, and it's almost a line, is very modest. So we've got more species, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, I don't know, 11. We've got more species, and they're all relatively present. You can locate them in almost any survey you conduct, assuming it's not a drive-by. So that's one way to represent your species richness and evenness simultaneously. We still don't know what this means, but this is something called a log normal distribution. And if logarithms were something you happily left behind in high school, fine with me. What it is a bell curve, and a Gaussian curve, a normal curve. and I don't think I spelled this right. So, what, with substantial sampling, what one finds is something which is often like this. In other words, there are a handful of species, this many, that have very large numbers of individuals in them. There are quite a few species that have moderate numbers of individuals within them. And then there are a small number of species which show fewer individuals. And when you get to this veil line, it tells you, if you draw the curve like this, it tells you haven't sampled hard enough. Because what you've missed is all the really uncommon people. And when you sample further, you'll find them. But time and money being what it is, we usually don't do this. But for whatever reasons, communities exhibit log normal distributions. The normal distribution is said to occur among statisticians, at least that's what they say, when large numbers of independent effects are being imposed on a system. Well, we have large numbers of a huge array of possibilities of interactions. So we should expect some kind of normal distribution for the individuals that are participating in those interactions. So looking ahead to sampling, I found a graph looking at plants in the Galapagos. So this is number of trips, and this is number of species. So a lot of trips result in a lot of species. Notice the curve hasn't even leveled off yet. So these people have not sampled, and these are two heavy-hitting scientists that are working in the Galapagos Islands. And if you know anything about islands, Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson said in 1967 that the bigger the island, the more species. But it turns out their sampling effort was a better descriptor of species richness on the islands than was the size of the island. So if you're lazy, you're not going to find them. That's what it boils down to. John, you know this. You find new stuff in new places all the time. And you're one of those people who's forgotten more about a place than the rest of us together. So log normal distribution and rank order graphs are ways that people throw down quickly for visual inspection what they found. I'll just mention functional groups. It's often a subset of a community is often thrown into a functional group, and what that means is we're capturing something they do that's important to them, and they all do it roughly the same way. So they're called guilds. The term showed up in 1967. Leaf gleaning birds are in a guild. Shredding insects in a stream as compared to filter feeders or predators. These are guilds. And you can compare richness of guilds if you want. There's a famous ecologist that says there are more birds in the tropics because there are more guilds, i.e. ways to do an important thing like finding food, and there are more species per guild. That's how we pack more species into the tropics. That would also play a role here. If you're interested in leaf gleaning guilds, if you have a worm-eating warbler, all of a sudden it only gleans leaves that are dead. So, oops, I got to do that. And then you got to worry about yellow-rumped warbler, which goes, I'm a flycatcher, nab, and I come back. Oops, I'm not a leaf gleaner only. So guilds also have their taxonomic problems, but they appear regularly. Another aspect of organization is that species are area sensitive. Sent a student to Madagascar, and she looked for lemurs in forest remnants. And she found, in big remnants, she found most of the lemur species that should have been there and would have been there if it was a still full forest. She got to smaller remnants, and some of the lemur species disappeared. In the smallest remnants, there was the mouse lemur. That was it. No other lemurs. So one characteristic we should think about is area sensitivity, which is often called nested subsets. The bigger basket has more species. The basket that fits inside of that, in terms of size, fewer. The tiny basket, and then the teacup has got a mouse lemur and a chickadee in it. Remember, you can't get there from here. I'm throwing it in again. This is the so-called kiddie tub experiment that I stumbled on 3 days ago. You're a Florida scientist, Jenkins, and you have a student who's an African, and you decide to produce 12 identical pools in communities. They're only 54 square feet if I did the arithmetic right. They're 0.04 hectares in size. 12 of them identical. Does not mention in the paper the spatial array. Sterilize the water, leave them for a year, come back and see who's there. They ought to have the same things in them. They don't. They're entirely different, one from the other. Two important points. You had to get there. These are planktonic organisms, right? These are copepods and cladocerans and algae and rotifers. How the hell did they get there? They got there in a year. So they get there. But who got there first? And was he or she a meanie and ate everybody else who came? It depended absolutely on who got there first as to what the species composition was going to be in each one of those 12 ponds. Too artificial to represent the real world? Maybe, but it's interesting. I.e., you got to get there, and you got to hope like heck that that you can fit in there, because you got serious competitors and or predators already there. If you walk in and you're the first person, you go, I'm Robinson Crusoe, I can do anything I want to do. Okay, we talk a lot about, when we talk about species, we talk about invasives and exotics. The only useful thing I can figure out about this is that healthy communities reject most exotics or marginalize them to paths. For example, I'm going to show you a picture of an orchid that I cherish. It's not a native orchid. It's exotic. But it's not invasive, because I've seen it along paths only, and 3 times on our property it's invaded. 3 individuals. Once I found it out in front of the house, and before I could protect it, that night a deer munched it down. My favorite organism, the white-tailed deer. I can't tell you the venom that spewed out of my mouth. Okay, then, hey, I'm reprieved. There's another one halfway up the driveway. Out goes the fencing, blah, 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 the thing blooms. But in the yard, a third one, in the garden, sitting there. I'm blessed. They're exotic, but hardly invasive. In 15 years, 3 individuals, as nearly as I can tell, and only in well-lit situations. If you go as I did to the Berlin Botanic Garden, when I was there in preparation for some motorcycle thing in Europe, I went to their meadow exhibit, and I thought, whoa, Vermont. It was Vermont. Virtually everything that you see in a meadow around here is European. And now, are they invasive? They are if you're in a meadow and you're a native species, but they're certainly exotic, and I think it's on the order of 27% of our flora is exotic. But only a handful of them are invasive. And those that are, boy, are they invasive. We have lost to Japanese knotweed. That's over. Please.
But according to what you said at the beginning,
Uh-huh.
opening.
I hate it
about
when somebody pays
everything being
attention.
temporary. But aren't these words, these terms, arbitrary if the notion of ecosystems are permeable and move, in other words?
Yes, they
How
are.
does this sit
Well,
in
here's,
context with what you said?
because we're alarmed at what we're doing, finally. I went to the Galapagos with some buddies, and we went to the Darwin Research Center, and I talked to an entomologist, and that person says, we get a new species of insect every day. Every day. Brand new to the islands. Where? On our bananas. You know, tourists want bananas. Or whatever it is that they bring in to feed the throbbing horde that goes through the Galapagos Islands. Every day there's a new insect. We've got, the exotics are rolling in. We've got woolly adelgid, not native to Vermont, is now. We've got Japanese longhorn beetle. We've got the emerald ash borer. They're coming, and they're affecting our forests. I was going to say ruining. That's a value judgment. They're affecting our forest. And we're alarmed. Not just because we want to have handles for our shovels out of ash, but we're alarmed. So at some point, we jump up and say, we got to do something about this. What little we do. Karen, please.
Well, I'm thinking back to this discussion, and you're going back to that thinking about space and time. So I'm also concerned about invasive plant species, for instance, but it's a lost cause in many cases.
Mhm.
The Japanese knotweed,
Mm-hmm.
may as well
Agreed.
just give it up.
Agreed.
But in the big picture, in the really big picture beyond our own little human lifespans, it's all going to work out in some fashion.
Bravo.
That's right. Isn't that what you was, that's what I was trying to
Yeah,
mention.
the world is homogenizing in every sense of the word. And some people in the Middle East are resisting the notion. Some species are resisting the notion, i.e. they don't move well. But other species piggyback incredibly well off of us. And the Zika virus is the best example I can think of. An obscure virus in the Congo. Hits Brazil, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, it's going to be in Florida. That's us. Honeybee colony collapse. There's a virus, crumpled wing, crooked wing virus. It's carried by a mite. We've moved the mite and the virus, and we're experiencing the demise of the honeybee. So that's going to happen. You're right. The world's going to homogenize, and the cynics among us would say, and I'm sorry, a paper that I had students read, and they went, yeah, so Planet of Weeds. It's an overstatement, but weedy species ecologically are species which get in and get out. Their whole trip is colonization. And as long as they don't have to compete very well, they're there. Rarely they compete very well, and they're really there. So the world is evolving into a planet of weeds. Us, roaches, rats, English sparrows, Japanese knotweed. I don't want to be a bummer here today, but I had a former student who got his PhD in the University of Arizona and joined the Forest Service research program in Hawaii. That's all they do, is research in Hawaii. And this guy was tasked with restoring the dry forests of Hawaii. People like dry forests to build houses on because they're easy to get rid of. Wherever it is, southern Brazil, Hawaii, wherever they are, parts of Mexico. Jalisco, the state of Jalisco is heavily built up. So he said, well, what were the dry forests? And he tried to reconstruct that. And then he ran into something called African something grass. He couldn't beat it. Bulldozers, couldn't beat it. Burns, came right back. He threw up his hands and said, it wins. I need napalm, I need major earth movers, I can't do it. And he quit. So that grass is going to be there. On the other hand, there's a lot we can do, and you all know that. So I just want to show you a picture of this orchid. I actually ought to skip it so we can get going, but no, it's a pretty orchid, and forgive me here, just
What
one.
is this orchid?
This orchid is one I grew up with a relative in California. This is the genus Epipactis. This is Epipactis helleborhini. I don't know its vernacular name. Epipactis is native of all places to Death Valley in California. That's not the only place where it occurs. It's a streamside orchid in much of central and southern California. Native there. But this is an exotic here. You look hard, it's got stems on its leaves on its stems. You can do this. And then it's got a bloom spike up top. And so the deer goes, no, 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 no. Anyway, it's a beautiful thing. And I cherish this thing. I fenced them off. But it ain't native. What am I doing? I don't think we're going to get overrun with them up there in Marlboro. But I'm going to talk about, since we're there, rarity now. Here's another utterly arbitrary word. Here they are. How many of them are there, and how hard do you have to look? Let's say you look infinitely long and you complete this curve. At what point on your list do you snap the line and say they're rare and they're not? I would defy somebody to be rational about that. But here's an attempt. Her name is Rabinovitz, and she did the following. She said, and I invite you to think about rarity yourselves. Sometimes you find rare things and they're everywhere, but they're just there. Sometimes you look and you look and you look and you look, and you find only one or two, and they still are restricted, or are restricted to a certain type of habitat. Sometimes they're not restricted. They're in a variety of habitats. They're always a treat to find because they're not common, and it's joy to find them. But they're in bunches of habitats, but they're never anywhere really common. And then there's the really common stuff. So this Deborah Rabinovitz said, look, if I look at the geographical distribution of species, I can find some species that exhibit a very wide biogeographical swath, and some which are smaller. I can't remember her precise words. But so the two categories, they occur over a wide range or they don't. That may play a role in thinking about rarity. The other thing she said was, yeah, some of them occupy a lot of habitats and some of them are very narrow in their habitat specificity. So habitat yep. Habitat can be broad. Whoops, I'm going to run out of room here. Plan ahead, Bobo. Broad or narrow. Sorry. Is that on the camera?
Okay.
Oh, good. Same here. Broad, narrow. And you know what? When I finally find them, when I look thoroughly, either that somewhere they're common or they're not. They're always a treat. So, numbers. Somewhere, large, always, small. So, she talked about 7 forms of rareness, because this is an American crow, say. Their geographic distribution is all the way across the country. They're found in all kinds of habitats, not just cornfields. They're up there fussing around in the woods and the compost at my place, and somewhere there are a lot of crows. I think we said we counted 400 on the Audubon holiday count this year. I'm not sure we counted correctly. It's an awful round number. It's the kind of thing that triggers the IRS. But that's common. So that's not rare. But what about the other 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 categories? She did an interesting thing. She asked all of the British botanists, the ones with the bow ties, here it's bolo ties over there. These are serious people that sit there and keep track of the details. To rank all the species of plants in Great Britain, and Great Britain can do this, they've been fussing over their plants forever, to rank them according to their rarity in the context of these delineations. They never found, they said, there isn't anything. When it was all, the dust settled, nobody had come up with a plant that was always in scarce numbers, that had broad habitat capacity, and that had a relatively modest range. Nobody, period. So she goes, well, maybe there's no such beast. But in this category, in this country, if you know what a red mangrove is, that's the category right here. You go to Florida, and if we haven't torn it up for marinas or whatever, or you go to Vietnam, anywhere in the world where you're, I don't know, south or north of 18 degrees, there's mangrove there, and red mangrove is often the dominant, the only species. So it has narrow habitat, i.e. the intertidal, the littoral zone of the intertidal, but worldwide, it's worldwide, and it's the only plant there. That's pretty common. But it's a kind of rarity, is it not? Because of its habitat, strict habitat requirements. So you can fill in these categories. I invite you to think about something like a peregrine falcon. Where does it go? Or, John, you think about your plants. Where do they go in these categories? So this is one attempt at delineating what rarity might be. Hi, Elizabeth. I'm supposed to look more often in this direction. Okay. Sampling. If you're a forester, I love the phrase, timber cruising. It means walking through the woods and going good, bad, and different. And that's your friendly bird walk, too. Let's walk along the setbacks, and we see the birds, and we count them. But that's a pretty informal sample. So in 1948, this big-brained person came up with the Holy Trinity, or if you prefer, the big three of sampling. If you're going to sample, if you cover more area, or you spend more time, or you've got more eyes, you'll find more stuff, period. Any combination of those three will result in more discoveries of more organisms and or species. So here's December, 19th this year? So I'm taking care of the southeastern Audubon bird count, and at the end of the form, they want to know how many observers, they want to know how many person hours were spent, they want to know how much area was covered. And they're trying to standardize the sampling protocols so that the data are more comparable. So if we did the same thing 2 years ago and we saw 142 crows, then in theory 400 crows makes some sense. But back in the good old days, we didn't do that, and there were hundreds of people in Santa Barbara, California, trying to beat out Corpus Christi or Cocoa Beach. And they were out there all day and all night, and they were calling in owls and stuff, and that's citizen science, but it's not citizen science that you can use in other than the species is there or it's not. It doesn't tell you anything about fluctuation in numbers per annual cycle. It doesn't tell you much. It simply says the critter's there or it's not. So citizen science is getting firmer at the level of the Audubon holiday count. So,
How about the hawk watch counts?
well, I'd have to ask John, do you keep track of it? Karen said, what about Putney Mountain Hawk Watch?
Too many variables.
Yeah, people like
Biggest
me.
One of which is eyesight. Some people have more than 20/20 eyesight. Some people have powerful spotting scopes. So many variables that you lose a lot of your values.
On the other hand, it's an incredible data set.
Oh, it's wonderful.
Yeah, so it's an unbelievably good data set. So, okay, I started thinking, whoa, sampling, political polling. Gallup, to get their plus or minus 4%, talks to 1,000 people. Period, that's it. That's all they have to do to get plus or minus 4%. They're very sure that they don't spend all their time in Manhattan or all their time in Dummerston, Vermont. So they're very careful to poll different demographic and different socio-political and different economic groups. And at the end of their 1,000, they go back and they say, did we do this right? Have we represented all people in the country? If this gets too close to home for some males in here, do you want to know if you have prostate cancer? Maybe not. But if you go in and say, do I have prostate cancer? And somebody says, all right, let's do a biopsy if that makes you feel better. What do? They collect 12 little samples, sometimes 16. And they say, no cancer. Well, did they sample adequately to find it? No, sometimes not. So there's a paper that in the medical literature that I stumbled across a month ago, and it said, boy, have we got software for you. You're combining data from ultrasound and prostate sampling to give you a much better idea about whether you have abnormal cells in your prostate or not. Organisms in the community. What do you want to know is how you go about sampling. If you want to know whether it's there, there's nothing random about that. If you're looking for pink lady slippers, we were talking about them earlier. Pink lady slippers are real picky about where they grow. They like a lot of light. And you can kill all your pink lady slippers if you let them get overgrown by bracken fern or something like that. So where do you look for them? At the edges sometimes of hemlock groves and the like, where vegetation doesn't overgrow them. You look along the roads of Marlboro, where the road crew cuts down the stuff, mows every year, so the competition for light for the lady slippers is reduced, and blah, blah, blah. In other words, you go to likely habitat and you sample there instead of randomly sampling, which would be a total waste of time. So what do you want to know? If you want to know about the relative abundance of something, is it common, then you got to sample in a totally different way. And then you would, random is a strange, wonderful concept, but ideally, you randomly sample X plots with some sort of careful analysis. And that'll tell you, over time, if your sample's big enough, who's common and who's not. So how one samples, in spite of the Holy Trilogy here, is absolutely a function of what you want to know. Okay, index organisms. PTE. Plecoptera, Trichoptera, Ephemeroptera. I agree. Insects, macroinvertebrates in your streams. There's nothing macro about them. They're about like this. And if you're really good, you can say, oh yeah, that's a da-da-da-da-da. But plecopterans are stoneflies. Trichopterans are caddisflies. These are Ephemeroptera, I love it, are the short-lived mayflies. No feeding, no nothing, just sex. And the adults are gone. So Ephemeroptera, I love it. So here we got 3 insects which tell us what? They can tell us, when there's relative abundance in a sample, they can tell us about water quality. Many members of the 3 families are intolerant of low water quality. So if your sample has bunches of PTE in it, you can go check, good water. In Canada, we trap fishers. Don't ask me why, but we do it. We do here too. So Canada adjusts the intensity of trapping on the basis of this index. 4 juveniles to 1 female. If that ratio is 4 or better, trap away. In other words, there is recruitment to the population. Just on that number, 4 or better. If it's 3.2, we got to slow down the trapping because recruitment to the population in the form of juveniles is being reduced. Twinning in deer, 1 N or 2?
2.
Okay, twinning in deer. If she's got twins, she's full of food, which means the deer herd is perhaps at some reasonable level. If she's not twinning, if they're only single, what do we call those things, calves? Fawns. Then there may be a lot of deer out there. There are plenty of other indices for deer, and I'll talk about that ad nauseum later. The state wants to know about how many moms you see with her chicks in the way of turkeys. Same idea. This is an index. It's a quick and dirty way of evaluating the vitality of something. Your stream ecosystem, your turkey population, whatever you like. When I walk down the driveway, I keep loose track of how many red Fs I see in the summer. And if I were serious about it, I could probably get a good idea about what's happening to the population by simply being careful about when I do it, i.e. warmth and humidity, the time of day I do it, probably early, maybe late, but not necessarily. And I'd maybe confine my data sampling to a month or so. Instead, I just go, oh yeah, hey, blah, blah, you got to get out of the road, little guy, da-da-da. But that's an index. And if the index is consistent and you've minimized the variables that John was talking about in your collection of an index, you can actually learn something that way. Depends on what you want to know again. Let's just see where we are. You're hanging in there really well. Hey. Okay. We made it. So, you can either go have lunch or we can talk about this a little bit more. Do you want to me to tell you about random sampling, or would that narcotize you? Or, indeed. Thank you. I did this at a wetland in Brattleboro. First of all, I had to decide where the wetland began and ended. This is a place called, was she also a Phyllis?
Phyllis Marsh.
Yeah. This was a woman, a remarkable woman, a very good naturalist for years and years, and she led us out to this place. which is technically a fen, i.e. it gets a nutrient influx and efflux, so it's enriched with nutrients, therefore it's not a bog. So she let us out there, and then she went to the big fen in the sky, and we named it after her. So I went there to sort of quantify things. Now ideally, this is what I would have done. It's not a very big place, but let's say it's like that. And let's say that I lay a grid over it. I do this on some kind of mapping program. And the grid, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is one way to do it, 5, 6, 7. And then I roll dice, say. And it gives me 8. And so I go, okay, we'll do that one. And I roll the dice. And it gives me 3. And I go, okay, we'll do this one. And it gives me some numbers. And I have generated a random sample. Now notice, the dice, they're picky people. That could be random. It's unlikely, but it could be a random sample. It looks clumped. But most of us make the mistake that random is regular. That's not random. It's not even vaguely close to random. It's highly unlikely, and it suggests some sort of dramatic interaction, if these were organisms, going on between them, that they hate each other. Something's happening, competition for water, something. But you have this grid, you have your dice, or some other mechanism, and you generate your spots where you're going to go sample. And then you do that. And it showed up in a paper that I'm going to tell you about. So you could come up with something called an importance value. Arthur has high importance value. We all do. It's this way. You put down your little plot. And if you're sampling trees, it's not little. It's decent sized. So it's a tape measure and a rope. You put it down, and you can determine frequency. How many times in each one of these does the plant show up? 100% of the time? 6% of the time? Anyway, that's frequency. How many of the samples have it? And then, in each sample, how many of them are there? The two together are often used, density and frequency are often used to generate something called importance value. If you're really serious, you could throw in a third variable, which is percent cover. In other words, what fraction of your sample plot is occupied by the plant? 3%, 2%, 74%. Whoa, that's common. So an importance value could also include percent cover or basal area. And this is all for plants. But do you see how to generate that? Now, the reason I've done this randomly is so that I can throw some statistics at it. If I don't, I end up with pseudo-replication, the dreaded term. These are all underneath, these three are all underneath the shadows of several big pine trees. Therefore, they're not separate samples. They're affected by the same variable. And that's pseudo-replication. So sampling is not a trivial thing in any stretch of the imagination. It's very complex, but this is the kind of sampling you would do to determine relative importance of whatever it is. Ovenbirds. So, some more on sampling. There are biostatisticians in all ecology departments in the country, and they're there to keep the biologists straight. Some biologists are good statisticians. I am not one of those. But those who are still go to this person and ask her, does this look good as a sampling protocol to you? I have a friend who lives in Putney, and he's finally found a home. He's here. He's back. He was a student at Marlborough College. He works at Dartmouth. He is the director of their emergency department, and he is responsible for trying to generate research protocols for graduate students or residents in that department. He was attracted by the dark side at one point, and that was he joined biotech. And he loves excitement, and he talked about the boost phase of some promising biomed. I'm taking one of those biomeds. I took one this morning. It's an amazing drug that has an amazingly targeted effect for my hepatitis C that I got 30 years ago in a bone marrow transplant. So all these companies want to make something like that so they can charge $1,000 a day per pill, which is what this thing costs. Not costing me that, but that's what it costs somebody who has the appropriate insurance. $1,000 per pill per day for, in my case, $56,000. So he got into one of these companies and he loves the boost phase. What is the boost phase? That's when one of these drugs may show efficacy, and it's his job as director of medicine in that company to design a protocol whereby they're going to know, in theory, whether they tell us is another matter, but they're going to know whether the drug works. And it's basically a sampling issue. How many replicates? How many individuals? What kind of demographics? It's a sampling issue for that person, that director of medicine in that biomedical company that dreams of getting bought up, and it almost happened by Johnson & Johnson in this case. But their drug didn't work. And he was just starting to figure that out, and Johnson & Johnson came knocking, and they wanted to know, does your drug work or not? And he says, who do I work for here? That's the dark side. It didn't work, and the company failed. So, sampling is everywhere. Okay, now next time we're going to talk about competition, predation, mutualisms, things like that, the stuff that is the glue to the individuals who occupy these communities.